Hi everyone, welcome back to another sew along. We will be sewing my newest Know Me pattern for fall 2025. This is ME2138. So this is a sweatsuit set. It is a sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants. Let me see if we can get a closer look here. So the cool thing about this is the sweatshirt has these style lines, kind of mimics kind of like a corset, and then the sweatpants also have style lines. There's a side panel, and then there's a built-in side pocket in that panel. It also has an elastic waist with a drawstring. And then to take it one step farther, I really thought it would be cool to include instructions for how to add in like piping or lace of any kind of trim you want along all those style lines to really highlight them. So for this sew along, we will be sewing view A, which is the sweatshirt. You can see here I am wearing the sweatshirt. I used the burgundy piping to highlight that corset shape. So this is a really fun one. I'm really excited about this. Okay, so let's take a look at the pattern envelope. It does come in two different size ranges, 4 through 12 as well as 14 through 22. Like I said, there are two views. View A is the sweatshirt. View B is the sweatpants. Now taking a look back here. So for the suggested fabrics, it says double knit, fleece, French terry, ponte, sweatshirt, fleece, etc. And then contrast for the sweatshirt, it should be a rib knit. That is recommended. For the sample pieces, I did use a rib knit trim. For the sample I'm going to be making in this sew along, I actually do not have a matching rib knit, so I'm going to be using the self fabric, which you can also do, but it is recommended for rib knit. So when you see that contrast here, that's what that means. Okay, and for notions, you will need piping or elastic ruffled trim for both the sweatshirt and the sweatpants. We'll go over that in a second. You'll also need 1/2 inch twill tape or ribbon for the drawstring and a 1/2 inch elastic for that waistband. Okay, so let's talk about some of the trims you can use. So for this sample for the cover, I used this piping. This is actually a stretch piping. You can use like a regular non-stretch piping if you want, especially if you're using a more stable knit like a French terry or something that doesn't have a lot of stretch. A regular piping should be good, but I use this stretch piping. You can usually find it in like the lingerie trims. For the sew along, I'm going to be using this Pico elastic, which is basically just an elastic with a fancy lace edge, also often used in lingerie. And then here is another Pico elastic. This one just has a smaller lace edge. You could also use a ruffle, whether you make your own ruffle or buy a ruffle trim. Another cute option would be like a little mini pom-pom trim like this. That could be cute. So there are a lot of different things that you can use for this. Really make it your own. I also want to talk about an option if you don't want to insert the trim. I think it would be really cute to color block. That's another option with all the different panels. You could also just do nothing. You can just sew the seams with no trim all in one color and just let those seam lines speak for themselves for a really subtle detail. That also could be cute. I think I'm going to do that for a fall sweatshirt soon. Now let's take a look at the pattern pieces. For the top, we have the upper front, which is cut on the fold. You also have the middle front, also cut on the fold. The lower front, as well as the lower side front. The lower front is cut on the fold, the lower side front is not. You also have your back pattern piece that is all one piece. And you have your sleeve, which is piece 8. In your rib knit fabric, or the same fabric depending on what you're doing, you have your neckband, your lower band for the waistband, and your sleeve band. To start with the sweatshirt, we are going to construct the front bodice with pieces 1 through 4. Make sure you have marked all of your notches and all of your dots. Okay, so we will start with piece 1, which is the upper front. So we need to attach our trim, whether it be your piping, your lace, your ruffle. I'm going to show you how to attach piping, trim, whatever it is, in a few steps on this first go. And then after that, I'm just going to tell you where, for all the other steps, I'm going to tell you where to attach it, and you will just follow these same steps. So to start, we want to mark the seam allowance on this seam along the bottom edge here. This is where the trim will be going. So mark your seam allowance. You can either use a marking tool, fabric marker, fabric chalk, or you can do a basting stitch. So here I have marked my seam allowance with a ruler and a fabric pen. That is, don't forget your seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. Now you just want to cut a piece of your trim that is about that length, and you will be laying it down on that seam allowance. So here you can see you want to lay the parts down that you want to stitch. So we want the lace to be showing. So you'll be stitching right at that edge where the lace and the elastic is. If you're using piping, you'll be stitching right up against that lip here. So you want to lay that part down on top of the seam allowance, the part that you want to stitch on. You can pin that in place if you want. Here it is, pinned in place so you can see it better. Let's take it over the machine and I'll show you. If you are sewing a piping, you will want to use either a piping foot or an invisible zipper foot. But since I am sewing a flat lace, that doesn't really matter, so I am using my regular foot. But just note that if you are sewing any piping as your trim, you need to use the appropriate foot. Okay, so I've lined up my seam allowance here, the trim with the seam allowance, and I am just going to slowly stitch it on. Okay, so I've stitched on that trim at the 5/8 of an inch. Now we're going to take piece 2, which is the middle front, and we're going to place them right side together. And we're going to line up this bottom rod edge. I'm actually going to flip this over and do it from the top part because we are going to use this stitching from where we stitch on the trim. We're going to use that as a guide. So make sure you match up all your notches. So that's stitched, or I'm sorry, that is pinned together, right sides together. Now you're going to just sew again, 5/8 of an inch. You're going to use your stitching from before as the guide. Follow that stitching exactly, because then you will be sewing exactly where you want on that trim. And I forgot to mention before, but even though you are working with knit fabrics, anywhere that you sew in the piping or the trim, you will want to use a straight stitch, not a zigzag stitch. Zigzag stitch will not work with the piping, etc. So use a straight stitch on these parts. Now I'm just going to sew following my stitch line. And there you go. There is my first line of trim. I did finish the raw edge with my serger. You do not have to do that, but you can if you like. Just press that seam down towards that middle front section. Give it a really good press. And that's it. So let's set that aside for a minute. And we're going to take out our lower front piece 3. Again, make sure the notches are marked, open it up, and you are going to attach your trim in the same manner along both sides here, like so, and then take pattern piece 4 and the side with the double notch here, that is the side that lines up, matches up here. So right sides together. Again, I am actually going to flip it to this side because we will be using that stitching as our guide. Line up the raw edge, matching up the double notch, and stitch over your existing stitching there 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Okay, so then you repeat the process with the other side panel on the attaching it to the other side of the lower center, and then press the seams towards the sides. And that's it. There's the lower part. Okay, one more round of trim to attach for this top. You are going to attach your trim along this top edge of this lower section in the same manner that we've done all the other trim. Okay, like such. Now you can bring your top half back in and right sides together. Just going to turn this around. Once again, line up those raw edges, match the notches, and stitch over that 5/8 of an inch stitching that you already have here. Once that's on, you can press that seam up towards the middle section here, and your front bodice is assembled. So now you can take your back bodice and the right sides together, lay them down on top of each other, line up the shoulder seams and both side seams here, and sew here and here 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. And you can now switch to using a zigzag stitch for the rest of these seams. Okay, so that's done, sewn and pressed. So let's grab our neckband next and just fold it with right sides together and stitch 5/8 of an inch along this short edge. Okay, with your bodice right side out, place your neckband around the bodice. The seam of the neckband will line up with the center back of the bodice. The notches on the neckband will line up with the notches on the front bodice, and the small dot on the neckband should line up with the shoulder seam. Once that is all pinned on, you will want to stitch 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge around the entire neckband. Once that's stitched on at 3/8 of an inch, you can stitch again 1/8 of an inch away from that within the seam allowance all the way around. Alternatively, if you have a serger, you could just serge the edge, which is what I'm going to do, but if you don't, stitch again 1/8 of an inch away within that seam allowance. Next, you just need to press that band up with the seam allowance pressed down. If you want to add a tagging, I would pin it in now. And then just edge stitch close to the seam, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge stitch all around that neckline. You do not have to use a zigzag stitch here. You can if you want. I did use a straight stitch. Moving on to the lower band here, you're going to place the two pieces right side together and stitch the short ends 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge, and then press those seams open. Just like with the neckband, you then want to fold lengthwise with wrong sides together to create this loop. Bodice right side out. You want to slide the lower band around so the raw edges line up, match up the seams of the lower band with the side seams of the bodice, and then match up all the notches. You will need to stretch the band a bit to get it to line up with the raw edge of the bodice. stitched on 5/8 of an inch. You can then stitch again 1/4 of an inch away within the seam allowance. Just like with the neckband, I'm going to use my serger, but if you do not have an overlock serger, yes, stitch 1/4 of an inch away in the seam allowance and then trim that seam allowance close to that second row of stitching. And then once again, just like with the neckband, press the band out with the seam allowance up and then edge stitch on the bodice, not the band, edge stitch close to the seam about 1/8 of an inch away. Okay, let's move on to the sleeves. So you're going to start with one sleeve and fold it together, right sides together. Line up this long edge here, stitch 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge along this long edge. Okay, so you can do that and then repeat the same thing on the other sleeve. And then take your 2 sleeve bands and fold each one in half with right sides together and stitch each one along the short end 5/8 of an inch. Okay, just like with the other bands, you will press that short seam open and then fold in half with wrong sides together. That creates the cuff here. And with your sleeve inside out, wrong side facing out, you want to slide the wristband inside, match up the seam of the cuff with the seam of the sleeve, match up all the other raw edges, all along the wrong edge, line it all up, and pin from the cuff side. You may have to stretch it a little bit. There you go, that's in there, it's pinned. Stitch from the inside. It's easier if you do it from the cuff side on the inside here. Stitch 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. And just like with the other bands, you can either serge the edge or stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the first one within the seam allowance and then trim the seam allowance close to that second line of stitching. After you do that, just like with the other bands as well, you'll want to press the seam allowance in towards the sleeve with the band out and then edge stitch close to that seam. Last step for the sweatshirt is to attach the sleeves to the bodice. So turn your sweatshirt bodice here inside out, keep your sleeve right side out. Make sure you have the right sleeve because there are notches to indicate front and back, so you want to make sure you have the right one here. When you do, slide it in here so that your sleeve and your bodice are right side together. You are going to match up the underarm of the sleeve with the underarm of the bodice. And then there is a small dot on the sleeve that lines up with the shoulder seam. And then just continue lining up the other dots and notches, aligning the raw edges. And go ahead and stitch around that sleeve 5/8 of an inch. Again, once that's stitched, stitch again 1/8 of an inch away within the seam allowance, and then you can trim off a little excess. Or like me, as I have been, I use my serger. Repeat with the other sleeve, and your sweatshirt is done.